Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by Austral Asset Management. Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy, is our guest today at Mizuho Bank, is our guest today. Now, Vishnu, welcome to the show.
Hi, Brian. Good to be here. Thank you for having me on the show.
Vishnu, before we get your insights, we're going to take a look and see how markets have performed around the region. We'll start with crypto markets. Bitcoin is at 23,714. It's up 2.25%. Ethereum is at 1,635. It's up 2.33%. Now, looking across the regional equity markets, we start with the Straits Times Index, where you're at. It's down 0.32%. We've got Bursa Malaysia, which is up slightly at 0.01%. Shanghai is up 0.55%. ASX All Ordinaries is down 0.02%. The Nikkei is down 0.07%. The Hang Seng is down 1.56%. Rounding up the numbers, we've got the Kospi, which is down 1.31%. Vishnu, your thoughts on market performance in the first half of the day?
Well, as we can see, the markets are fairly mixed. And I think there's good reason for that. One is we did end last week on a fairly positive note. Markets were fairly buoyed, particularly going into the US. I think there are some hopes that with the US looking to step down on its pace of rate hikes this week, markets were somewhat more put at ease. However, I think going into this week, that's where markets are on the lookout for volatility for a few reasons. One is, of course, the FOMC meeting, and that's really a mixed bag if we think about it a little harder. On the surface, the Fed is going to step down to a 25 basis point hike from a 50 basis point hike back in December. So that's on the surface, that's where the relief, which we saw being quite richly priced in, comes through. But at the same time, there's also a sense that the Fed may talk a little tougher to remind markets they are not done with the rate hikes, that peak rates may have to go above 5%, which is a whole percentage point above where we are now. And right after that, so the FOMC meeting is Wednesday, US Wednesday, and followed by Thursday, that the ECB and the Bank of England, and both of these central banks may do a 50 basis point hike because inflation hasn't come down enough. And so therein lies the rub. We can either look at it as an opportunity for a slightly weaker dollar on a comparative basis, which usually fuels risk-on rally, or we can see it as uncertainty because policy can go a lot tighter and markets taking a step back. And particularly against a backdrop of the short selling going on with Adani, and also markets may be waiting to see what happens in terms of COVID after all the Chinese New Year visiting and travel in China. These things may be, these factors may be a reason to hold back a little bit on optimism, particularly given that January has been a good run for markets.
Now, one of the key things that obviously will temper investor sentiment is the earnings season. Is that something that perhaps will temper the Fed as well? Is that an expectation that good earnings will then basically almost force the Fed's hand in terms of the pace of tightening and the pace of interest rates hikes?
I think the reaction to good earnings, especially if it's an outsized reaction, then I think the Fed may then say, look, they need to tighten a little bit more than they had suggested earlier. The earnings itself, I don't think the Fed will be very hung up because there's a clear understanding that there's a lag between tightening and it taking an effect on the real economy. So the Fed fully expects that any deterioration in earnings will only come through with a lag of a few quarters. However, if markets get overly exuberant, what the Fed then refers to as, and to use their exact term from their December minutes, unwarranted loosening in financial conditions. Loosening in financial conditions meaning equities going a lot higher, the bond yields going lower, things like that. If there's an excessive rally in markets, the feel-good factor, the Fed may point out that, guys, ironically, because markets are so pumped up, we may need to tighten more to rein in activity, expenditure, spending, so that inflation can come back down. So you make a really good point there, Brian, which is earnings and the consequence of earnings, particularly overly exuberant markets, may have a self-dampening effect if we cast it a little further out.
Now, Vishnu, final question. What are some key events and data points in the Asia Pacific region that may stir up markets this week? You've talked about in the ECB decision and the Bank of England in Europe, but then in Asia, are there things that we should be watching out for this week?
I mean, so the first thing I'll point out is, even in Asia, I think they're going to cast their eyes towards the West, whether it's the Fed, followed by the ECB and the Bank of England on Thursday. That said, on the same day as the Fed, in India, there'll be a big watch, big spectatorship going on because it's India's budget for FY 23-24. There are two aspects of this which will be important for us. One is, apart from, let's assume you're not an India watcher and you're not greatly interested in it. It will still be of importance for two reasons. One is to see directionally where do budgets need to head in the region, given that there's been a lot of expenditure, first due to COVID in 2020, 2021, and in 2022 due to the subsidies needed, budgets deficits were tended to be a bit wider. So India reining in their budget deficit may set the tone for the rest in the region, because there's definitely going to be a relative comparison. The other is the risk assessment that markets make of it, particularly with the Adani disruption in terms of India sentiments. If the reaction to India's budget is not very positive, I think Asian policymakers may also want to reassess what the risks of capital outflows are in the region. So that's just worth watching, alongside the Fed as well.
As always, it's great to have you every Monday. Vishnu, thanks for your insights and thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure to be here, Brian. Thank you.
Now, we've been speaking to Vishnu Varathan, Head of Economics and Strategy at Mizuho Bank, on BizTech's Asian Midday Market Watch, powered by Austral Asset Management. I'm Brian Fernandez. This video and podcast will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. It'll also be on our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.